There was a moment in my life when I believed I was facing a political decision. Only later did I understand that it was a decision about my soul. My name is Ibrahim Traoré. Many people know me as the president of Burkina Faso. They know the speeches, the meetings, the military uniforms, the difficult choices, and the headlines that travel across Africa and beyond. But very few people know the private struggles that happen when the cameras are gone and the doors are closed. Before I became a national leader, I was simply a man trying to serve his country as faithfully as possible. I have never claimed to be perfect. I have made mistakes. I have faced fear, uncertainty, and moments when I did not know what the next day would bring. Yet through those years, one thing remained deeply rooted in my heart: my belief that God sees what human beings cannot see. My faith in Jesus was never something I viewed as a political tool. It was not a slogan, and it was never part of a strategy. It was personal. It was the quiet source of strength that carried me through difficult moments long before the world knew my name. For many years I remained silent about a particular experience because I believed some stories should be protected until the right time. But as I look at the world today, I see many people facing pressure to compromise their values, their convictions, and their faith. Some are pressured by money, others by power, others by fear of losing opportunities they worked their entire lives to obtain. That is why I have decided to tell this story now. What I am about to share began after I became the transitional president of Burkina Faso in the year 2022. At first, I believed the greatest battles ahead would involve security, economics, and national sovereignty. Those challenges were certainly real. But I soon discovered that some battles are invisible. They happen in private rooms. They happen through carefully chosen words. They happen when powerful people offer you everything you think you need while quietly asking you to surrender the one thing you should never lose. For a long time, I thought the pressure surrounding my leadership was only political. Then I learned that some people wanted something far deeper. They wanted to change who I was. And as the pressure increased, I found myself standing before a choice that would alter the course of my life forever. What happened next is something I have never fully shared in public until now. When I first accepted the responsibility of leading Burkina Faso, I understood that our nation was facing enormous challenges. Large parts of the country had suffered from insecurity for years. Communities had been displaced, families had lost loved ones. Many citizens had begun to wonder whether their nation would ever regain stability. The situation was not something that could be solved with speeches alone. The people needed results. They needed to see that change was possible. During the first months of our administration, we focused heavily on strengthening national defense and rebuilding confidence among our citizens. Resources that had once been directed toward unnecessary privileges were reviewed. We looked carefully at how public funds were being used. We examined areas where money could be redirected toward priorities that directly affected the future of the country. The armed forces needed support. Local communities needed protection. National projects needed investment. Most importantly, the people needed hope. Progress did not happen overnight. Nothing meaningful ever does. Yet little by little, signs of improvement began to appear. Areas that had lived under fear started seeing greater security. Citizens who had lost confidence began believing again that their country belonged to them. Wherever I traveled, I noticed a change. People still faced difficulties. They still worried about food prices, jobs, education, and healthcare. But behind those concerns, there was something else. There was hope. Hope is a powerful force. When people begin to believe that tomorrow can be better than today, they become willing to endure hardship in order to build a future. I saw that spirit growing across Burkina Faso. Farmers spoke about returning to their fields. Teachers spoke about educating the next generation. Young people spoke about building businesses and contributing to their communities. For the first time in a long while, many citizens felt that the nation was moving in a direction they could support. Naturally, this encouraged me. I believed we were proving that determination, discipline, and national unity could accomplish things many observers considered impossible. But as our progress became more visible, something else began to happen. Messages started arriving from outside the country. At first, they seemed harmless. Some came through diplomatic channels. Others came through advisors. Others arrived through individuals who claimed they wanted to help. The messages were usually polite. They often began with compliments. They praised our efforts. They congratulated us on improvements. They expressed admiration for the growing confidence among our people. Yet almost every conversation eventually moved in the same direction. The tone would change. The compliments would become warnings. The encouragement would become concern. One advisor told me that rapid change often creates powerful enemies. Another said that many influential people were becoming uncomfortable with the direction Burkina Faso was taking. A third individual advised me to be careful about challenging long-established systems. I listened respectfully. Leadership requires listening. Even criticism can contain useful information. Still, I found it difficult to understand why our efforts would concern anyone outside our borders. We were working to improve security. We were investing in national development. We were encouraging self-reliance. We were trying to create opportunities for our citizens. None of these goals seemed controversial, yet the warnings continued. Some people spoke in general terms. Others became more direct. They suggested that certain international interests preferred predictable leaders. They preferred governments that followed established expectations. They preferred arrangements that remained unchanged. One evening after a long meeting, a trusted colleague sat with me and spoke more openly than anyone else had. He looked at me carefully before saying something I never forgot. "Success attracts attention," he said, "but not all attention is friendly." At the time, I nodded politely. I understood what he meant on a basic level. Every leader faces criticism. Every government encounters opposition. That is simply part of public life. What I did not understand was how serious the situation would eventually become. As the months passed, our achievements continued. Security operations produced results. Development initiatives moved forward. Public confidence grew. Yet alongside those successes, I noticed that more and more influential figures wanted private conversations. Some meetings seemed unusually urgent. Some visitors appeared unusually interested in matters that had little to do with the subjects they claimed to discuss. A few individuals spoke as if they already knew decisions that had not yet been made. Others seemed less interested in Burkina Faso itself than in shaping the future direction of its leadership. Looking back now, I can see the pattern clearly. At the time, however, the pieces did not yet fit together. I believed I was dealing with normal diplomatic pressure. I believed I was navigating ordinary political realities. I believed the challenges ahead would involve policy, economics, and security. I had no idea that a far more personal test was approaching. The warnings I received during those months were not about military strategy. They were not about budgets. They were not about development projects. They were preparing me for something entirely different. Soon, a group of influential representatives would arrive in Ouagadougou. They would present an offer that seemed almost impossible to refuse. And hidden behind their promises was a condition that would force me to confront the most important decision of my life. That meeting would change everything. The first message arrived quietly. It came through channels that normally handled diplomatic communication. There was nothing unusual about that. Governments speak with one another every day. Representatives travel constantly. Meetings are arranged. Discussions take place. At first, I assumed this invitation was no different. I was told that a group of influential international representatives wished to meet with members of our administration. They wanted to discuss future cooperation, economic development, security partnerships, and long-term investment opportunities. Those topics sounded entirely reasonable. Burkina Faso needed investment. We needed infrastructure. We needed stronger economic growth. We needed every legitimate opportunity available to improve the lives of our citizens. For that reason, I agreed to the discussions. The visitors arrived several weeks later. Their delegation included diplomats, financial experts, policy advisors, and several individuals whose official roles were never fully explained. They carried themselves with confidence. It was obvious they represented organizations and networks with significant influence. The meeting was scheduled in a highly secure area of Ouagadougou. Access was carefully controlled. Only a limited number of officials were permitted inside. The atmosphere felt professional, but there was also something unusual about it. Everyone seemed extremely careful with their words. No one rushed. No one revealed too much too quickly. The discussions began exactly as I expected. Economic cooperation was the first topic. They presented reports, projections, and development plans. The numbers were impressive. Their proposals included major investments that could transform key sectors of our economy. Roads could be built. Industrial projects could expand. Energy systems could improve. Employment opportunities could increase. As the presentations continued, the scope of the offer became even larger. Military assistance was discussed. Training programs were proposed. Equipment support was mentioned. Intelligence cooperation was offered. The package seemed designed to address nearly every challenge facing our country. The representatives spoke confidently. They described a future where Burkina Faso would experience rapid development. They spoke about international partnerships. They spoke about modernization. They spoke about stability and prosperity. One of them looked directly at me and said something that remained in my mind long after the meeting ended. "President Traoré, within a few years your country could become an example for the entire region." It was an attractive vision. Any leader who genuinely loves his people wants opportunities that improve their lives. I was no different. As I listened, I thought about farmers. I thought about students. I thought about hospitals. I thought about families who had endured years of hardship. If these proposals were genuine, they could create meaningful change. The discussions continued over several days. Each meeting revealed additional possibilities. The financial commitments appeared enormous. The strategic support seemed extensive. The promises sounded increasingly generous. Yet despite all the positive language, something felt incomplete. The representatives spent very little time discussing the specific terms behind such extraordinary support. That struck me as unusual. Nothing of this magnitude is ever offered without expectations. In politics, economics, and international relations, every agreement involves responsibilities on both sides. I waited for those responsibilities to be explained. At first, they were not. Instead, the conversations remained focused on benefits. Benefits for our economy, benefits for our security, benefits for our international standing, benefits for our future. One evening, after another round of discussions, I sat alone reviewing notes from the meetings. The proposals appeared almost too perfect. Every challenge seemed to have a solution. Every obstacle appeared manageable. Every concern was answered with another promise. I remember asking myself a simple question. What do they really want? Not what they say they want. Not what appears in official documents. What do they actually want? The answer did not come immediately. The next day, however, I began noticing subtle changes in the conversations. The representatives became more interested in leadership philosophy. They asked questions about cultural identity. They asked questions about social values. They asked questions about religion. At first, these discussions seemed casual. Many international organizations are interested in cultural issues. There was nothing inherently suspicious about that. Still, I noticed a pattern. The questions always moved in a particular direction. They were not simply gathering information. They appeared to be measuring something. They wanted to understand what influenced my decisions. They wanted to know which principles guided my leadership. They wanted to know where my deepest loyalties rested. One representative asked me whether personal faith should play any role in public leadership. Another asked whether traditional religious beliefs could limit national progress. A third asked whether modern societies needed to move beyond certain spiritual ideas in order to fully embrace the future. The questions were presented politely. No one argued. No one demanded answers. Yet I could feel that these subjects mattered greatly to them. Far more than roads, far more than investment, far more than economics. At the time, I still believed these were merely intellectual discussions. I assumed they reflected differences in worldview. People from different cultures often see society differently. That alone did not concern me. What concerned me was the growing realization that these conversations were becoming increasingly personal. The focus was shifting. Less attention was being given to Burkina Faso. More attention was being given to me. My beliefs, my values, my convictions. The meetings continued. The promises remained on the table. The opportunities still appeared extraordinary. Yet I began sensing that we had not yet reached the true purpose of these discussions. Something remained hidden beneath the surface. Something important. Something that explained why such powerful individuals had traveled so far and invested so much effort. I did not know exactly what it was, but I knew the answer was coming. And when it finally arrived, it would reveal that the billions of dollars, the military support, the intelligence cooperation, and the promises of political security were only part of the story. The real condition had not yet been spoken aloud, but it was waiting. And very soon, it would be impossible to ignore. By the time the next round of meetings began, I had already started paying closer attention. The proposals remained attractive. The promises remained impressive. Nothing had changed on the surface. Yet I could feel that the conversations were moving towards something much larger than economics or diplomacy. The shift happened gradually. No single statement revealed everything. No one walked into the room and delivered an ultimatum. Instead, the condition emerged piece by piece. One conversation led to another. One question opened the door to the next. Eventually, the true purpose behind the discussions became impossible to miss. The first indication came during a private session attended by only a small number of people. The atmosphere was different from previous meetings. The formal presentations were gone. The charts and economic reports were gone. The language became more personal. One representative spoke about the future of global leadership. He described a world that was becoming increasingly interconnected. He argued that successful leaders needed to embrace new ways of thinking. According to him, the old divisions of nationality, culture, and religion were obstacles that needed to be overcome. I listened carefully. At first, nothing he said sounded unusual. Many people believe globalization requires greater cooperation. That idea is not controversial. Then he continued. He explained that the most influential centers of power increasingly preferred leaders who represented what he called a universal vision. Leaders, he said, should avoid strong public associations with religious convictions. Leaders should present themselves as symbols of a broader human identity. Leaders should move beyond traditional beliefs that might create divisions. As he spoke, I began to understand where the conversation was heading. Another representative joined in. He said that many international institutions were becoming uncomfortable with public expressions of religious faith among national leaders. According to him, such expressions created barriers. They limited acceptance within certain circles. They complicated partnerships. Again, I listened. Then came the statement that changed everything. One of the men leaned forward and spoke very calmly. He said that I had the potential to become one of the most influential leaders in Africa. He said doors could open that most politicians never even see. He said support could be provided on a scale that would permanently transform Burkina Faso. Then he paused, and finally he explained the expectation. Not a treaty, not a resource agreement, not a military concession, not an economic demand, something entirely different. They wanted me to publicly align myself with a global leadership initiative that promoted a new ideological vision. Participation would require public statements. It would require symbolic actions. It would require distancing myself from religious influences in matters of leadership. Most importantly, it would require me to publicly reject the idea that my personal faith in Jesus played any role in guiding my decisions. For several moments, I said nothing. I simply looked at them. Part of me wondered whether I had misunderstood. The request seemed so unexpected that it felt unreal. I had prepared for negotiations involving money. I had prepared for negotiations involving politics. I had prepared for negotiations involving security. I had not prepared for this. I asked them to explain more clearly. They did, very clearly. They believed that leaders should represent a new vision of society, a vision that treated religious commitment as a private relic of the past, a vision that celebrated spirituality only when it was disconnected from conviction, a vision that allowed faith to exist so long as it never influenced leadership. One of them smiled and assured me that I would not actually need to change anything internally. He said appearances were what mattered. Public perception was what mattered. The statements were what mattered. According to him, I could keep whatever personal beliefs I wished. I simply needed to stop presenting them as meaningful. The more they spoke, the more uneasy I became. Because I realized something important. They were not asking me to sign a document. They were asking me to redefine who I was. For years, my faith had remained personal. I did not use it as a political weapon. I did not use it to attack others. I did not believe government should force religious belief upon anyone. But faith still mattered. It shaped my conscience. It shaped my understanding of responsibility. It shaped my understanding of right and wrong. Now these individuals wanted me to publicly declare that such beliefs were irrelevant. One representative attempted to reassure me. He described the request as a small adjustment, a symbolic gesture, a necessary step toward greater international acceptance. The benefits, he reminded me, would be enormous. Investment, security, influence, political stability, global support. Everything remained available. Nothing had changed. Except for one thing. The condition was now visible. As the meeting continued, I asked several questions. What would happen if I declined? The answers were vague. No direct threats were made. No one raised their voice. No one issued warnings. Yet the implications were obvious. Support depended on cooperation. Opportunities depended on alignment. Partnerships depended on participation. The message remained polite, but it was unmistakable. That evening, after the meeting ended, I returned to my office and sat quietly for a long time. The city outside continued as normal. People went about their lives. Traffic moved through the streets. Families gathered in their homes. Children prepared for school. Most citizens had no idea what had been discussed behind those closed doors. And why would they? The conversation seemed abstract. The consequences were invisible. Yet I understood that something significant had happened. For the first time since becoming president, I faced pressure that had nothing to do with governing. This pressure targeted identity itself. Who was I? What did I believe? What principles could not be negotiated? Those questions suddenly mattered more than budgets or development plans. Over the following days, additional meetings took place. The same themes returned repeatedly. The representatives remained patient. They never appeared angry. In some ways, that made the situation more difficult. Hostility is easy to recognize. Polite persuasion can be far more dangerous. Again and again, they emphasized opportunity. Again and again, they described the future that could be achieved. Again and again, they suggested that faith belonged in private life and nowhere else. The pressure remained subtle, but it was constant. And with each conversation, I realized that the offer placed before me was not merely political. It was spiritual. A choice was approaching. A real choice. One path promised influence, resources, protection, and international approval. The other path was uncertain. At that moment, I still believed I would have time to think carefully. I believed I could weigh the options. I believed there was no immediate urgency. I was wrong, because only a few weeks later, the pressure would intensify dramatically. Promises would begin turning into consequences. Projects would suddenly encounter obstacles. Support would begin disappearing. And through intermediaries, a message would arrive that removed every remaining doubt about what was expected of me. The choice was no longer theoretical. The ultimatum was coming. After the hidden condition had finally been revealed, I hoped the situation would remain a matter of discussion. I believed there would still be room for disagreement. I believed reasonable people could respect different convictions and continue working together. For a short time, that appeared to be true. The meetings became less frequent. The representatives returned to their respective organizations. Publicly, everything seemed normal. Official statements remained polite. Diplomatic relationships continued. Nothing dramatic happened immediately. Yet beneath the surface, a different reality was beginning to unfold. The first signs were subtle. Projects that had previously moved forward smoothly began encountering unexpected delays. Requests that normally received quick responses suddenly remained unanswered. Certain forms of support became difficult to secure. Meetings that had once been easy to arrange became strangely complicated. At first, I assumed these were ordinary bureaucratic problems. Large institutions often move slowly. Governments frequently experience delays. There was no reason to assume anything unusual. But then the pattern continued, and it expanded. One development initiative faced obstacles, then another, then another. The explanations rarely made sense. Every delay seemed to have a different reason. Every problem appeared unrelated to the others. Yet together they created a picture that was difficult to ignore. Around the same time, I began noticing changes in international media coverage. Criticism itself did not surprise me. Every leader receives criticism. That is part of public life. What caught my attention was the sudden coordination of certain narratives. Stories appeared that repeated remarkably similar themes. Commentators who had shown little interest in Burkina Faso suddenly became very interested. Articles began presenting our government in increasingly negative ways. Again, criticism alone was not the issue. The issue was timing. The shift happened shortly after the discussions concerning faith and leadership. That coincidence was difficult to overlook. Several trusted advisors noticed the same thing. Privately, they shared their concerns. Some believed powerful interests were attempting to create pressure. Others believed international perceptions were being influenced deliberately. No one could prove anything. But many people sensed that something had changed. Then the indirect messages began arriving. They came through intermediaries, not official representatives, not public statements, not written documents. Instead, they came through individuals who moved comfortably between political, financial, and diplomatic circles. The first message was carefully worded. It suggested that cooperation remained possible. The second message was more direct. It implied that certain opportunities would remain unavailable unless specific concerns were addressed. The third message left very little room for interpretation. One evening, an intermediary requested a private conversation. He spoke respectfully. He was not hostile. In fact, he seemed almost sympathetic. That made the conversation even more unsettling. He explained that many influential people remained interested in supporting Burkina Faso. He said resources were available, partnerships were available, protection was available, but he also said there were concerns. The same concerns I had already heard before. My public identity, my values, my faith. Then he delivered the message I had been dreading, not as a threat, not officially, simply as information. According to him, many powerful individuals believed I faced a choice. I could embrace the direction they preferred, or I could prepare for increasing isolation. The statement was delivered calmly, yet its meaning was unmistakable. The following days were some of the most difficult of my leadership journey, not because I was afraid for myself, not because I feared criticism. Leaders must accept criticism. The real burden came from another question. What if refusing their demands harmed the people of Burkina Faso? That question haunted me. Every time I thought about the situation, I returned to the same concern. Millions of citizens depended on decisions made by their government. Children needed schools. Families needed hospitals. Communities needed roads. Farmers needed support. Security operations required resources. Development required investment. What if my refusal made all those goals harder to achieve? That possibility troubled me deeply. The pressure continued increasing. The messages became clearer. Eventually, one intermediary summarized the situation in a single sentence. I remember it exactly. You must decide what matters more. Then he paused. Your faith or your future. The words stayed with me long after the conversation ended, because I knew what he actually meant. He was not talking about my future. He was talking about my presidency, my influence, my position, my ability to shape events. The assumption behind the statement was obvious. Like many others before me, I would eventually choose power. Most people would. History is filled with examples. Men and women have compromised principles for far less. Some have surrendered convictions for money, others for status, others for security, others simply to avoid conflict. The people applying pressure seemed convinced that I would eventually do the same. Perhaps they believed every person has a price. Perhaps they believed faith becomes negotiable when enough power is offered. Perhaps they believed political survival always wins. Whatever their reasoning, they appeared certain of the outcome. What they did not understand was that their confidence created an entirely new struggle inside me. Not a struggle between faith and disbelief. My belief remained intact. The struggle was between competing responsibilities. Responsibility to God, responsibility to country, responsibility to millions of people whose lives could be affected by my choices. Night after night, I found myself asking difficult questions. What if compromise could save lives? What if symbolic concessions could secure resources that would help countless families? What if refusing resulted in greater suffering? The questions were relentless. There were no easy answers. Every argument seemed to contain some truth. Every possibility carried risks. The pressure was no longer coming only from outside forces. Now it existed inside my own mind. That was the most dangerous stage of all. Because external pressure can often be resisted, internal doubt is much harder to defeat. As the weeks passed, one final message arrived. This time there was no ambiguity, no hidden meaning, no diplomatic language. A final meeting was being arranged. The expectation was clear. A decision would be made. The opportunity remained available. The support remained available. The promises remained available, but only if I accepted the new direction being offered. The meeting was scheduled for the following morning. Everyone involved seemed confident they already knew the outcome. They believed the process was complete. They believed enough pressure had been applied. They believed no rational leader would walk away from what was being offered. And to be honest, there was a moment when I was no longer certain myself. For the first time since the entire ordeal began, I found myself wondering whether they might be right. Perhaps there was a way to compromise. Perhaps there was a way to give them what they wanted while still serving my country. Perhaps the sacrifice was smaller than it appeared. Those thoughts followed me into the final days before the meeting. They grew stronger. They became harder to ignore. And eventually they brought me to the edge of a decision that I never imagined I would consider. A decision that nearly changed everything. A decision I almost accepted. What happened next remains one of the most difficult admissions I have ever made. There are moments in life when people imagine courage as something simple. They imagine a clear choice between right and wrong. They imagine certainty. They imagine confidence. The truth is often very different. Sometimes the greatest tests arrive disguised as reasonable compromises. Sometimes the most dangerous decisions appear practical. Sometimes the path that leads away from truth begins with good intentions. This is the part of my story that is the most difficult to tell, because it requires honesty, not about others, about myself. After weeks of pressure, delays, warnings, and private messages, I found myself standing in a place I never expected to reach. I began considering their proposal, not because I wanted power for myself, Not because I desired approval from influential people, not because I had abandoned my faith, made the situation so complicated. Every time I thought about refusing, another question appeared. What if my decision hurt the people I was trying to serve? The more I reflected on the future of Burkina Faso, the heavier the burden became. I thought about villages that still lacked essential services. I thought about communities struggling to recover from years of insecurity. I thought about families waiting for opportunities that had never arrived. I thought about children whose futures depended upon decisions being made in offices far away from their homes. Again and again, I returned to the promises that had been placed before me. Investment, infrastructure, security cooperation, development, resources, support. The scale of those promises was enormous. Even if only part of them became reality, millions of people could benefit. At least that was what I kept telling myself. The human mind is remarkably skilled at finding ways to justify difficult decisions, especially when those decisions appear to serve a greater good. I began constructing arguments. Perhaps faith could remain private. Perhaps public statements were only words. Perhaps symbolism was less important than practical outcomes. Perhaps I was focusing too much on principles and not enough on results. These thoughts did not arrive all at once. They developed gradually, day after day, conversation after conversation, question after question. Each one moved me a little closer toward compromise. I never stopped believing in Jesus. That was not the issue. The issue was whether belief could be separated from action, whether conviction could be hidden when circumstances demanded it, whether silence could replace honesty. I remember sitting alone one afternoon reviewing reports about development needs across the country. The numbers were overwhelming. Every page represented real people, real struggles, real needs. As I read those reports, I found myself asking a question that many leaders throughout history have probably asked. What if one compromise today prevents greater suffering tomorrow? At first, the question seemed reasonable. Then it became persuasive. The pressure from outside continued. The pressure inside became even stronger. Eventually, I stopped thinking only about what I would lose. I started thinking about what Burkina Faso might gain. That shift changed everything. Because once the focus moved entirely toward outcomes, compromise began appearing more attractive. I told myself that perhaps I could accept certain conditions without fully embracing them. I told myself that perhaps I could navigate the situation carefully. I told myself that perhaps wisdom required flexibility. The reasoning sounded convincing, dangerously convincing. One evening, a trusted associate noticed that something was troubling me. He asked whether I was carrying too much responsibility alone. I smiled and changed the subject. I did not tell him what was happening. I did not tell most people. Very few individuals knew the full situation. The burden remained largely private, and in private, compromise often becomes easier, because there are fewer voices to challenge your reasoning, fewer people asking difficult questions, fewer reminders of what truly matters. As the date of the final meeting approached, I spent longer hours thinking, longer hours analyzing, longer hours weighing consequences. The arguments in favor of acceptance seemed practical. The arguments against it seemed costly. That imbalance began influencing my judgment. I started imagining what success might look like. New roads, new schools, expanded hospitals, economic growth, greater stability, international partnerships. The vision was powerful. And because it involved helping others rather than helping myself, it felt morally defensible. That was the trap. Looking back now, I understand something important. Not every harmful decision begins with selfish motives. Some begin with fear. Some begin with exhaustion. Some begin with sincere concern for other people. That realization came later. At the time, I could not see it clearly. All I saw was a difficult choice. A choice between uncertainty and opportunity. A choice between resistance and cooperation. A choice between principle and what appeared to be practical progress. Eventually, I reached a point where I was no longer rejecting the proposal. I was considering how to accept it. Even writing those words now is uncomfortable, but it is the truth. I had not officially agreed. I had not signed anything. I had not made any public statement. Yet inside my mind, the possibility was becoming increasingly real. The final meeting had already been scheduled. The expectation was obvious. Everyone involved believed I was moving toward acceptance. And to be honest, I was no longer sure they were wrong. The evening before the meeting arrived, the next morning would likely determine everything. If I accepted, a new path would begin. If I refused, I had no idea what consequences might follow. The uncertainty was exhausting. I felt pulled in different directions. One voice reminded me of promises. Another reminded me of principles. One voice focused on immediate results. Another focused on long-term consequences. Neither seemed easy to ignore. As darkness settled over the city, I carried that struggle with me. The meeting was only hours away. The decision felt closer than ever. And for the first time since the entire ordeal began, I believed there was a real possibility that I might choose compromise. I did not know it then, but that night would become one of the most important nights of my life. Because before the sun rose again, something would happen that would completely change my understanding of the choice before me. Before the final meeting, before the final decision, before the final answer, a different voice would speak. And everything I thought I understood would be transformed. The evening before the final meeting felt unlike any other night I had experienced since becoming president. I had carried heavy responsibilities before. I had faced difficult choices before. I had dealt with uncertainty, criticism, and pressure before. Yet this felt different. The burden was no longer simply political. It was personal, deeply personal. As darkness settled over Ouagadougou, the atmosphere around me seemed unusually quiet. The city continued its normal rhythm, but inside my office everything felt still. The reports on my desk remained there. The schedules remained there. The documents for the next day's meeting remained there. But I found it impossible to focus on any of them. My thoughts kept returning to the same place. The decision, again and again. The decision. I walked through the arguments one more time. If I accepted, significant opportunities might become available. If I refused, those opportunities could disappear. If I accepted, many obstacles might be removed. If I refused, new difficulties could emerge. Every path carried consequences. Every possibility carried uncertainty. For hours, I sat alone thinking. Yet the more I thought, the less clarity I seemed to gain. Eventually, I realized something important. I had spent weeks analyzing the situation. I had consulted advisors. I had reviewed possibilities. I had examined risks. But I had spent very little time doing the one thing that should have come first. Praying. Not formal prayers. Not quick prayers spoken out of habit. Real prayer. Honest prayer. The kind of prayer that comes when a person has reached the limits of his own understanding. That realization struck me deeply. Because somewhere during the pressure, the negotiations, and the constant calculations, I had begun relying more on strategy than faith. More on analysis than trust. More on my own reasoning than God's guidance. That night, I decided to stop. I pushed aside the reports. I ignored the schedules. I turned away from the endless calculations that had consumed my thoughts. And I prayed. I prayed longer than I had in a very long time. Not because I knew exactly what to say, but because I no longer knew what else to do. I spoke honestly. I admitted my confusion. I admitted my fear. I admitted my uncertainty. I admitted that I was tired. Very tired. The pressure of leadership can be difficult to explain. People often see public appearances and official statements. They see confidence. They see decisions. They see authority. What they do not always see are the moments when a leader feels completely alone. The moments when every option appears costly. The moments when no decision feels safe. That night was one of those moments. As I prayed, I stopped asking for success. I stopped asking for victory. I stopped asking for favorable outcomes. Instead, I asked for something simpler. I asked God to show me the truth, whatever that truth might be, even if it was difficult, even if it was uncomfortable, even if it required sacrifice. I simply wanted to know what was right. Hours passed. The room remained quiet. No voice spoke. No dramatic event occurred. No immediate answer arrived. Yet something began changing inside me. The noise that had filled my mind for weeks slowly started fading. The endless arguments became quieter. The pressure became less overwhelming, not because the situation had changed, but because I had finally stopped trying to carry it alone. Near midnight, exhaustion began overtaking me. The previous weeks had drained me physically, emotionally, and mentally. I could feel it. My thoughts became slower. My body felt heavy. Even remaining awake required effort. I remember looking around the room one final time. The same documents were still waiting. The same meeting still awaited me the next morning. The same decision still stood before me. Nothing had been resolved. At least not yet. Eventually I rested, not because I felt confident, Not because I felt certain, simply because I no longer had the strength to continue. As sleep approached, one final prayer remained in my heart. A simple prayer. Show me the right path. Nothing more, nothing less. Then I drifted into sleep. What happened next is difficult to describe, not because I have forgotten it. Quite the opposite. The experience remains clearer in my memory than many events that occurred while I was fully awake. Years have passed since that night, yet the details remain vivid. The atmosphere, the presence, the words, the understanding that followed, everything remains etched into my memory. I did not know it at the time, but I was about to see something that would completely transform my perspective. Something that would reveal consequences I had never considered. Something that would answer questions I had been unable to answer myself. Most importantly, I was about to encounter a truth that would change the course of my decision. A truth that no advisor had provided. A truth that no political strategist could offer. A truth that no international representative could explain. When sleep finally took hold, I expected rest. Instead, I entered an experience that felt more real than any dream I had ever known. And in that place, surrounded by a light unlike anything I had seen before, I would come face to face with the one I had been praying to. The one whose answer I had desperately sought. The one whose words would forever change the direction of my life. That was the moment everything began. What I am about to describe is not something I can fully explain through ordinary language. There are experiences that seem to exist beyond the limits of human vocabulary. No matter how carefully a person chooses words, something remains impossible to capture completely. This was one of those experiences. When I first became aware of my surroundings, I immediately understood that I was no longer in my office. I was no longer in the residence. I was no longer in any place I recognized. Yet strangely, I was not afraid. That realization came first. Peace. Not confusion, not panic, not uncertainty. Peace. A deep peace, unlike anything I had ever experienced before. I found myself standing in a place filled with light. It was not the harsh brightness of the sun. It was not the artificial light of lamps. It was something entirely different. The light seemed alive. It illuminated everything, yet it did not hurt my eyes. It revealed everything, yet it created no fear. The atmosphere felt pure, calm, complete. For several moments I simply stood there, trying to understand where I was, trying to understand what I was seeing. Then I became aware that I was not alone. A presence was approaching. Even before I saw him clearly, I sensed something extraordinary. Authority, compassion, strength, peace, all existing together in perfect balance. Then I saw him, Jesus. The moment is difficult to describe because my first reaction was not surprise. It was recognition, a deep certainty, the kind of certainty that leaves no room for doubt. I knew who he was, not because someone told me, not because I reasoned it out. I simply knew, the same way a person knows daylight from darkness, the same way a person knows truth when it stands directly before him. He stood before me with a calmness that immediately removed every fear I had carried. For weeks I had been burdened. For weeks I had been confused. For weeks I had been struggling. Yet in his presence, those burdens seemed smaller, not because they were unimportant, but because I suddenly realized they were not beyond his understanding. What surprised me most was what did not happen. He did not condemn me. He did not accuse me. He did not remind me of my weakness. He did not rebuke me for nearly agreeing to compromise. I think part of me expected correction. Instead, I encountered mercy, understanding, patience. The kind of patience that sees every fear a person carries and still chooses to love him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he looked at me, and I felt as though every thought I had struggled with over the previous weeks was completely visible. Nothing hidden, nothing concealed, everything known. Yet I felt no shame, only truth. Then he spoke. His voice was calm, clear, gentle. Yet there was an authority within it unlike anything I have ever heard. The first words remain with me to this day. You are looking at what they promise. The statement immediately brought the negotiations to my mind. The offers, the opportunities, the resources, the support. Everything that had consumed my thoughts. Then he continued, but I see what comes after. Those words changed everything. Because suddenly I understood that my perspective had been limited. I had been focused on immediate outcomes, immediate benefits, immediate opportunities. I had been evaluating the future based on what was visible. But he was showing me something beyond visibility, something beyond the next few years, something beyond political success. Then the scene around me began changing. I cannot explain exactly how. One moment I stood in the light. The next moment I was witnessing a series of events unfolding before me, not as symbols, not as vague impressions, as realities. The first vision showed a future in which the agreement had been accepted. At first, everything appeared successful. Investment arrived, projects expanded, partnerships increased. International approval followed. Many people celebrated, many believed progress was accelerating. Looking at it from the outside, the decision appeared wise, practical, effective, exactly what supporters of the proposal had promised. But then the vision continued, and slowly the deeper consequences emerged. I saw dependence growing, not all at once, step by step, decision by decision, compromise by compromise. What began as cooperation gradually became control. Important national decisions increasingly required approval from outside influences. Policies were shaped by expectations that did not originate among the people of Burkina Faso. The appearance of sovereignty remained, but the reality weakened. Then I saw something even more troubling. The freedom of faith did not disappear immediately. It diminished gradually, subtly, quietly. The process was so gradual that many people barely noticed. Faith was tolerated, then restricted, then marginalized, then treated as something outdated, something irrelevant, something to be hidden. I watched as future generations grew further removed from the spiritual foundations that had once guided them. The vision was heartbreaking, not because people were forced to abandon belief, but because they were encouraged to forget why belief mattered. Then Jesus showed me something else. The consequences extended beyond politics, beyond economics, beyond institutions. I saw ordinary people, families, children, communities, people searching for meaning in a world that increasingly measured everything by power, wealth, and approval. Many possessed material success, yet they lacked peace. Many possessed opportunities, yet they lacked purpose. Many possessed comfort, yet they lacked truth. The contrast was painful, because I realized that no amount of development can replace the human need for moral and spiritual direction. No amount of wealth can satisfy a soul that has forgotten what it was created for. As these visions unfolded, I understood something I had failed to see. The proposal before me was not simply about one statement, one meeting, one compromise. It represented a direction, a path, a future. Then Jesus spoke again. His words were direct. The disaster you fear is not the greatest danger. I reflected on the pressures facing Burkina Faso, the economic challenges, the security challenges, the political challenges. Those were the disasters I feared, yet he was showing me something greater. The danger of sacrificing truth for temporary advantage. The danger of exchanging conviction for convenience. The danger of gaining influence while losing purpose. At that moment, I finally understood why my heart had been so troubled. Because deep down, I already knew the choice was not truly about politics. It was about identity. It was about faith. It was about whether principles remain principles when they become expensive. For a long time, I simply watched, listened, learned. The weight of what I was seeing felt overwhelming. Yet at the same time, clarity was beginning to emerge. The confusion that had dominated my thinking for weeks started disappearing. The arguments that had once seemed persuasive began losing their power, because I was finally seeing beyond the promises, beyond the offers, beyond the pressure. I was seeing consequences, real consequences, and I knew that once a person truly sees the future cost of a compromise, it becomes much harder to justify accepting it. Still, one question remained, a question that weighed heavily upon my heart. If the path they offered was wrong, what alternative existed? How could I refuse without harming my country? How could I reject the pressure and still protect the people I had sworn to serve? That question remained unanswered, at least for the moment. Then Jesus looked at me again, and I sensed that what he was about to reveal next would become the most important part of the entire encounter, because he was not only showing me what to avoid, he was about to show me a path I had completely failed to see. After witnessing the future that unfolded through compromise, I remained silent for a long moment. The visions had answered many questions. They had revealed consequences that I had never considered. They had exposed dangers hidden beneath promises. Yet one problem still remained. Perhaps the most important problem of all. I understood why I should not accept the offer, but I still did not know what I was supposed to do instead. That question weighed heavily on me, because leadership is not simply about rejecting the wrong path. A leader must also find the right one. I looked at Jesus and spoke honestly, the same way I had prayed honestly earlier that night. I told him my concern. I told him about the people. I told him about the responsibility. I told him about the burden I felt whenever I thought about the future of Burkina Faso. How could I refuse such powerful support and still protect my nation? How could I reject the pressure without creating greater difficulties? How could I defend principles without damaging the very people I wanted to help? The question came from my heart. And for the first time since the entire ordeal had begun, I felt that someone truly understood the depth of it. Jesus listened. Then he answered, not with condemnation, not with impossible demands, but with wisdom. Wisdom that completely changed how I viewed the situation. What surprised me most was that he did not tell me to fight everyone. He did not tell me to isolate Burkina Faso. He did not tell me to reject cooperation with the world. Instead, he showed me something I had failed to consider. A third path. Not surrender. Not reckless confrontation. A third path. A wiser path. A stronger path. A path built on patience, faith, and long-term vision. As he spoke, new scenes began unfolding before me. I saw partnerships forming in places where I had not expected them. I saw relationships developing with nations and leaders who respected sovereignty. I saw opportunities emerging from directions that had previously seemed unimportant. The message became clear. The future was not limited to the options currently standing before me. That realization struck me powerfully. For weeks, I had allowed myself to believe that only two possibilities existed: accept the conditions or suffer the consequences. But Jesus was showing me that reality was far larger than those two choices. The people applying pressure wanted me to believe they controlled every door. They wanted me to believe all meaningful opportunities flowed through them. They wanted me to believe there was no alternative. But that was not true. The future belonged to God, not to any institution, not to any government, not to any network of influence. Doors could open where no one expected them. New relationships could emerge. New opportunities could appear. The vision continued. I saw Burkina Faso investing more deeply in self-reliance, not isolation. Self-reliance. There is a difference. A nation cannot depend entirely on others for its future. Partnerships matter. Cooperation matters. But dependence creates vulnerability. I saw efforts to strengthen local capacity, local industry, local agriculture, local innovation. I saw citizens becoming active participants in national development rather than passive observers waiting for solutions from elsewhere. The message was unmistakable. True strength grows from within. External support can help, but it can never replace internal resilience. Then Jesus showed me something else. Perhaps the most important lesson of all. I saw ordinary people, not politicians, not diplomats, not wealthy investors. Ordinary people, families, workers, teachers, farmers, students, the foundation of the nation. I realized that throughout the pressure and negotiations, I had become so focused on powerful individuals that I had nearly forgotten where the true strength of a country comes from. A nation is not built primarily by those who hold influence. It is built by its people. When citizens possess hope, dignity, responsibility, and purpose, extraordinary things become possible. The future of Burkina Faso would not ultimately be decided in foreign meeting rooms. It would be shaped by the determination of its people. That truth felt both humbling and liberating, because it reminded me that leadership is not about controlling everything. It is about serving something greater than yourself. The vision continued unfolding. Then Jesus addressed the issue that had caused so much confusion. Faith. I had feared that maintaining my faith might somehow conflict with serving the nation effectively. But he showed me something different. He showed me that faith should never be used as a political weapon. It should never become a tool for manipulation. It should never become an instrument for division. Yet neither should it be abandoned. Faith belongs in the heart. It belongs in character. It belongs in conscience. It belongs in the principles that guide decisions when no one is watching. The lesson was profound. I did not need to turn faith into politics. And I did not need to remove faith from my life. I simply needed to remain faithful. That was enough. As the understanding settled into my heart, much of the fear that had troubled me began disappearing. not because the challenges ahead would vanish. They would not. Not because opposition would disappear. It would not. Not because difficulties would somehow become easy. They would not. The peace came from something else. Clarity. For the first time in many weeks, I could see a path forward. A difficult path, but a real path. Jesus then spoke words that remain among the most encouraging I have ever heard. He said that if I remain faithful, other doors would open. Not necessarily immediately, not necessarily in the ways I expected, but they would open. At that moment, I understood something that many people struggle to accept. Faith does not guarantee comfort. Faith does not guarantee convenience. Faith does not eliminate uncertainty. What faith provides is confidence that uncertainty is not the same thing as abandonment. God can lead people through situations they do not fully understand, even when the road ahead appears unclear, even when powerful voices insist there is no alternative, even when circumstances seem impossible. The encounter was changing me. The fear that had nearly driven me toward compromise was losing its grip. The arguments that had seemed so persuasive only hours earlier now appeared incomplete, because they had been built upon a false assumption, the assumption that the future depended entirely upon human power. Now I understood differently. The future belonged to God. Human beings could influence events, but they did not control destiny. As that realization settled deeply within me, the atmosphere around us seemed even more peaceful than before. The burden I had carried for weeks was beginning to lift. Not because every question had been answered, but because the most important question had. I now knew what I needed to do. I knew which path I could no longer take, and I knew which path I must follow. The choice that had once seemed impossible suddenly became clear. The next morning, I would enter the final meeting. The people waiting there believed they already knew my answer. They believed the pressure had worked. They believed compromise was inevitable. They believed power would triumph over conviction. What they did not know was that something had changed, completely changed. The man who would walk into that room would not be the same man who had nearly agreed only hours earlier. When I finally awakened, every detail remained vivid in my memory. The words, the visions, the lessons, the peace. Nothing felt distant. Nothing felt unclear. I remembered it all, and I knew exactly what I had to do. The final meeting was only hours away. Everyone expected me to accept. Instead, I was preparing to make a decision that would shock them all. When I opened my eyes that morning, the first thing I noticed was clarity. For weeks, my thoughts had been crowded with competing arguments. For weeks, I had wrestled with uncertainty. For weeks, I had carried a burden that seemed impossible to resolve. Now the confusion was gone. The challenges remained. The risks remained. The consequences remained. But the confusion was gone. I sat quietly for several minutes, reflecting on everything I had experienced during the night. The encounter felt as real as any event I had ever lived through. The words remained vivid. The lessons remained clear. Most importantly, the fear that had nearly driven me toward compromise no longer controlled me. That did not mean I suddenly felt fearless. Far from it. I understood that difficult days could still lie ahead. I understood that refusing the offer might create new obstacles. I understood that opportunities could disappear. The difference was that I no longer believed those possibilities justified abandoning what I knew to be right. For the first time since the entire situation had begun, my heart felt settled. The final meeting was scheduled for later that morning. Preparations proceeded as usual. Schedules were confirmed. Security arrangements were reviewed. Everything appeared normal from the outside. Yet inside, everything had changed. As I traveled to the meeting location, I found myself thinking about the people of Burkina Faso. Not the politicians. Not the diplomats. Not the powerful individuals involved in the negotiations. The ordinary citizens. The people who woke early to work. The families struggling to build better lives. The young people hoping for opportunities. The elderly who had endured difficult decades and still prayed for a brighter future. Those were the people I served. Those were the people I had promised to represent. And as I thought about them, I understood something important. Leadership is not merely about obtaining resources. It is about preserving the principles that make those resources meaningful. A nation can gain wealth and still lose its soul. A leader can gain influence and still fail his people. Material progress matters, but it cannot become the highest goal. Eventually, I arrived at the meeting. The atmosphere felt familiar. Many of the same individuals were present. The same confidence. The same professionalism, the same expectation. As I entered the room, I sensed that most of them believed the outcome. Had already been decided. Weeks of pressure had been applied. Weeks of persuasion had taken place. From their perspective, resistance had been gradually weakening. Why would they expect anything else? The meeting began politely. There were greetings. There were formalities. There were brief discussions about the opportunities still available. Then the conversation moved toward its true purpose. The moment had arrived. One representative spoke first. He reviewed the potential benefits, the investments, the partnerships, the support. Everything remained available. Another individual emphasized the importance of making a forward-looking decision. He spoke about progress. He spoke about global integration. He spoke about leadership. Finally, they asked for my response. The room became very quiet. I remember looking around the table. Many faces, many expectations, many assumptions. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Then I began. First, I thanked them. That surprised some of them, but gratitude was appropriate. Not because I agreed with everything they had proposed, because respect matters. Even when people disagree, I thanked them for their time. I thanked them for the discussions. I thanked them for the interest they had shown in Burkina Faso. Then I explained my decision, calmly, clearly, without anger, without hostility, without accusation. I told them that I could not accept the condition they had placed before me. I told them that my faith was not a political strategy. It was not a public image. It was not a negotiable asset. It was part of who I was. I explained that leadership requires compromise in many areas. Policies can change. Strategies can change. Partnerships can change. But there are certain principles that cannot be traded without losing something essential. The room remained silent. Some people appeared surprised. Others appeared disappointed. A few seemed genuinely confused. I continued. I told them that I was not rejecting cooperation. I was not rejecting partnership. I was not rejecting friendship with other nations. What I was rejecting was the idea that progress required abandoning conviction, that prosperity required surrendering identity, that acceptance required denying faith. Then I said something that even surprised me as I spoke it. I told them that if Burkina Faso succeeded, I wanted that success to be built upon honesty, not pretense, not performance, not hidden compromises. Honesty. For several moments, no one responded. The silence felt heavy, not hostile. Heavy. Eventually, one representative asked whether I understood the consequences of my decision. I answered truthfully, no. I did not know all the consequences. No leader ever does. The future remains uncertain for everyone, but uncertainty alone cannot determine what is right. That answer seemed to end the discussion. The atmosphere changed. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was gone. The expectations had been disrupted. The outcome they anticipated had not arrived. The meeting concluded shortly afterward. There was no dramatic confrontation. No one shouted. No one issued threats. Everything remained polite. Yet everyone understood that something significant had happened. A choice had been made. As I left the building, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. Not triumph, peace. The situation remained unresolved. Challenges still awaited. The future still contained risks. But the internal conflict was over. That alone felt like freedom. The months that followed were not easy. Some opportunities disappeared. Certain pressures continued. Obstacles emerged. Difficulties remained. Yet something else began happening. New relationships developed. New partnerships emerged. New possibilities appeared. Some came from directions that few people had anticipated. Others emerged gradually through persistence and patience. Not every door closed. In fact, some entirely new doors opened. Doors that I had been too distracted to notice before. Over time, I found myself reflecting often on the lesson hidden within the entire experience. Power is temporary. Positions are temporary. Influence is temporary. Every title eventually passes to someone else. Every office eventually belongs to another person. Every earthly achievement has limits. But when a person sacrifices his conscience in exchange for those things, the cost can become immeasurable. That lesson extends far beyond politics. It applies to business. It applies to families. It applies to everyday life. People everywhere face moments when compromise appears profitable. Moments when abandoning principles seems practical. Moments when immediate rewards hide long-term consequences. Those moments reveal who we truly are. Looking back now, I understand that the greatest battle I faced during that period was not against external pressure. It was against internal fear. Fear of losing opportunities. Fear of making the wrong decision. Fear of uncertainty. Once that fear lost its power, the path became clear. And yet, there is one final part of this story that still amazes me. Years after those events, I learned what happened to some of the individuals who had been involved in delivering that ultimatum. Certain careers collapsed unexpectedly. Certain institutions faced crises no one predicted. Certain alliances fractured. Some of the people who appeared powerful and untouchable discovered how fragile human power can be. I do not share that information with satisfaction. I take no joy in the difficulties of others. Instead, it serves as a reminder. Power is never permanent. Influence is never guaranteed. Human plans can change overnight. That is why placing ultimate trust in worldly power is always dangerous. Today, when I think about that season of my life, I do not remember the negotiations first. I do not remember the pressure first. I do not remember the offers first. I remember the lesson that changed everything. A person may lose a position. A person may lose influence. A person may lose opportunities. But if he loses his soul in the process, he has lost far more than he realizes. And perhaps the greatest miracle of all was that I was shown this truth before it was too late. That is why I have finally chosen to tell this story. Not because it is a story about politics, not because it is a story about power, but because it is a story about faith, conscience, and the choices that define who we become when no one else is watching. After everything I experienced, I came to understand a truth that is far more valuable than political influence, wealth, or public recognition. Power cannot save the human heart. Money cannot heal a troubled soul. Titles cannot provide lasting peace. Only faith, compassion, integrity, and a sincere commitment to what is right can guide a person through life's greatest trials. The world today carries many wounds. We see conflict, division, fear, greed, and hatred in many places. We see people fighting for power while others struggle simply to live with dignity. We see nations facing uncertainty and families carrying burdens that often remain unseen. My hope is simple. I pray for Burkina Faso. I pray for Africa. I pray for the people of the United States. And I pray for every person listening to this story, wherever they may be in the world. Let us turn away from what destroys us. Let us reject greed when it tempts us. Let us refuse hatred when it seeks a place in our hearts. Let us choose kindness over cruelty, forgiveness over bitterness, and service over selfishness. None of us are perfect. All of us face struggles. Yet even in the darkest moments, hope remains possible. That is one lesson I will never forget. No matter how difficult circumstances become, do not lose hope. Light still exists for those who continue believing, continue praying, and continue walking forward with courage. I believe God is with Burkina Faso. I believe God is with Africa. I believe God is with the people of America. And I believe God is with all who sincerely seek what is good, just, and true. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to leave a prayer for your family, your community, your nation, and for peace in our world. Together, let us continue sharing hope with those who need it most.